Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to clarify some major points that get brought up when people discuss things when we talk about training, and it's that people who don't know the difference between strength training, powerlifting, and bodybuilding. And that might seem counterintuitive, but it actually isn't. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And I think it's important to understand this because when you start looking at basic biomechanics and you start looking at the reasons people train, the overwhelming majority of people out there actually do need to be strength training. And I mean, it doesn't even matter what your actual goals are, because training for strength is how you achieve all these other endeavors that you want, meaning your base is strength training. And I don't care whether your goal is change body composition, gaining muscle, gaining performance for boxing, for powerlifting, for football, whatever it is you happen to be doing. Strength training is your general foundation. And strength training is essentially training for strength. In other words, improving the amount of weight you can lift for 1 rep, 3 reps, 5 reps, 10 reps on big, basic exercises. That's strength training, right? And that's your foundation for everything. And the difference here, people will confuse this and say, well, I don't want to be a power lifter, so I'm not going to do that. I want to be a bodybuilder. When the reality is that person might not be planning on doing either one. Because what people need to remember, powerlifting and bodybuilding are specific competitive endeavors. They are specific competitive endeavors. And when you say that, people say, well, I'm not talking about pro bodybuilding. Well, 99% of bodybuilders are never going to be pro bodybuilders. Just like 99% of football players are never going to be professional football players and make a living at it, right? In fact, it's more than 99%. Far less than 1% of anybody who does any of those endeavors competitively will ever make a living doing them. But by that same token, so that people understand this, powerlifting is one word. It doesn't mean lifting for power. It means the sport of powerlifting. Bodybuilding doesn't mean building your body. Bodybuilder is one word. Bodybuilding is one word. It's a competitive endeavor. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I'm building my body, therefore I'm a bodybuilder. You know, that's the same Joe Weider nonsense. He tried to use to sell supplements back in the day and use bodybuilding to promote it. He would say, well, anyone who's working out and exercising is a bodybuilder, while he's hosting the competitive professional endeavor and paying for it to exist. No, he's just trying to popularize something that he was passionate about and involved in, that he marketed and was related to his income and business. It's not actually true. So, I mean, using that same logic, a football player is a bodybuilder because they need to gain muscle for their sport. A boxer who gains muscle for boxing is a bodybuilder using that logic. A power lifter is a bodybuilder using that logic. A sumo wrestler is a bodybuilder if you use that logic. It's not the case. And the ironic thing is that bodybuilding, and this is just being objective here, guys, I'm not judging any of these things, because I'm going to talk about how powerlifting isn't always strength training also. But the difference here, bodybuilders oftentimes go through phases where they do the opposite. They reduce their body. Their cutting phases where they peak for a contest involve stripping away body fat, but it usually costs them muscle also. The vast majority of bodybuilders lose muscle mass when actually getting ready for competition. So the actual act of preparing to compete in bodybuilding unbuilds some of your body. It's a little bit ironic, but people need to understand the difference. Bodybuilding is a competitive endeavor of building as much muscle mass and then symmetry, proportion, size, all of that, dieting down ultra lean after you've built this muscle, and then competing in an endeavor that involves not a performance element, but it's a performing art, a display involving posing, in many ways similar to dancing, which you have to pick very careful outfits, decorate your body in a certain way so that it highlights your muscles with fake tan, oils, things like that. It is a performing art, right? That's what it is. And if you don't compete in that performing art, you're not a bodybuilder. You might be training for overall hypertrophy, but if you're not using drugs, hypertrophy requires strength. In other words, you can't disconnect the two. The only way to build your body, to build any significant amount of muscle without using drugs to build it, is to get stronger. And the guys who use drugs to do it can oftentimes have an easier job of it if they focus on getting stronger. But barring that, it's still strength training is still the foundation of that. And that's what bodybuilding is. When you go over to powerlifting, when you say, hey, you talk to people about getting stronger on their squat or deadlift, they're like, well, I don't want to be a powerlifter. Well, so what? Are you trying to gain muscle? Are you trying to gain performance? Those two exercises have the potential to put enormous amounts of muscle on your body. So does a bench press. But for general strength training, I would never tell anyone those are the only 3 lifts you need to do. I would say you need a minimum for maximum development in both size and strength. You probably need to get really good at least 6 exercises, minimum of 6. Now, we could argue a lot more in many cases, but that's your baseline. So you need to understand the difference. Building strength, we're going back to strength is correlated with muscle mass, improving your overall performance so that you have a base to go whatever you choose to branch into. But powerlifting is very specifically a competitive endeavor to where you compete in a weight class to lift as much weight as possible on your squat, bench, and deadlift, and then combine together. Now, records are based on those individual lists, but who wins or loses is based on your total. In other words, it doesn't matter if you bench press 500 pounds and another guy benches 300 pounds in your class. If his squat and deadlift out totaled you so much that he beats you on total, he still beats you. Doesn't matter that you have a 500 pound bench press and he has a 300 if he beats you on total, right? You might get a bench record somewhere, but he still beats you. So powerlifting is essentially the sport to where your total in a weight class, and if it's cross class or cross age class, they have a Wilks score to determine that. And yes, age is just as important as body weight on that score. People forget that. But inside of your class to have a combined total of your squat, bench, and deadlift as much as anyone else. Now people say, well, that's strength training then, right? Well, no, not always. Not always. Because here's the thing. What's going to make you stronger? Working your closed grip bench press through a full range of motion and building your strength on that versus doing a really big arch and an ultra wide grip on a bench press. That closed grip bench press is going to build more strength. There are aspects of powerlifting that do not involve improving your actual strength or force production. They involve using technique to lift more weight. That doesn't involve you actually recruiting more muscle fibers, because recruiting of muscle fibers is where you get force production. Force production is strength. Strength is defined as the application of force against an external object, right? Or against an external resistance. Now, in this case, you can lift more weight with the same amount of force, or in some cases, less force. In fact, less force might be produced because some of the moment arms and some of the muscles are moving through a shorter range of motion. They may not be getting as much muscle fiber recruitment, but you lift more weight. So you need to understand the difference here. Powerlifting isn't always about getting as strong as possible. It's about lifting as much weight as possible in those lifts within the confines of the rules. And there are things that you can do that technically don't require the production of as much force, but let you lift more weight. Again, such as a very large arch on the bench press. A really big arch can trim inches out of the range of motion out of the hardest part. Incidentally, like I said, there might be less total muscle fiber recruitment involved, but more weight gets lifted. So powerlifting isn't always about who's the strongest. Sometimes it's a case of who can get into a leverage advantage to use the best technique. In some cases, that can involve more muscle fiber recruitment and more strength development. In other cases, no. And that's the difference. It's like Paul Carter always says, we train to build strength, not to demonstrate it. You demonstrate it in competition. And he applies the same logic, the same thing. Closed grip bench press, you can't lift quite as much weight, but it builds more overall strength and development in many cases. So he promotes that very idea. That's a perfect example. But strength building is always the foundation. It's always the foundation. But again, people need to understand the difference. So when we talk about training for strength, that doesn't mean that you're going to be a powerlifter. In fact, 99% of people who actually train for strength and understand the value of strength, and who actually might even be strong on the squat, they might be strong on the deadlift, doesn't mean that they're going to compete in powerlifting. Powerlifting is its own competitive endeavor, and yet getting strong on a barbell squat is a worthy endeavor for dozens of different goals that have nothing to do with the sport of powerlifting. It will make you a better football player. It will reduce your chances of getting cancer, diabetes, osteoporosis. Getting strong on a barbell squat is an all-around, generally healthy thing to do for every human being walking the face of the earth. Building a good, solid strength base on it. That's not the same thing as powerlifting. Just like training and gaining some hypertrophy isn't the same thing as bodybuilding. You know, we would never use that logic for anything else and say, well, I don't want to build any muscle because I don't want to compete in bodybuilding. See how silly that sounds? Be like, really? There's a lot of benefits to gaining muscle for a whole host of reasons that have nothing to do with competing in that fringe endeavor. Just like there's a whole lot of reasons to gain strength that literally have nothing to do with competing in powerlifting. All right? Strength building and strength training is the foundation of all physical performance endeavors. And I would argue, and many coaches out there would argue, is the foundation for even improving your fitness and health in the long term, improving your quality of life. So in other words, everyone should be strength training. Strength training should always be your foundation, whereas in powerlifting and bodybuilding are their own unique, specific competitive endeavors. And these things are all not mutually exclusive. There are people who compete in both powerlifting and who compete in bodybuilding who do pretty much the same training year round. Only thing that might change is their diet and the amount of cardio they do. But they might train really similarly for both of their competitive endeavors and be very successful at both. Because again, it comes back to the fact strength training is your foundation. It's your foundation for all these other endeavors. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.